Hello, welcome to the round 4 match of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020 between Mugwort and mastertan. So 2 Aussies in round 4, and this is a match to determine who will make it to the candidate stage of the Crazyhouse World Championship. And the loser still has a chance to qualify for the candidates by going into the elimination bracket, so it's not over yet even if you lose this match. So best of 10 games, 3+2, just about to get underway. So this is a live video, but it's a post-recorded voiceover. I've had a little bit of a chance to look at the games, so if I say something very intelligent, it probably means that I've looked at the position after the game. So mastertan is taking his time in game number 1 and coming up with an original opening. So it's a little bit similar to the Lone Wolf opening with d6, e6, knight f6, bishop e7, but slightly different move order. And the intention, as I realized, maybe a little bit too late in this game, but is to put the bishop on c6 at the right time. So he's waiting for me to push e5. So it's a little unclear in the first game especially whether the light square bishop belongs on c4 or d3. And in fact I put it on d3 in the other games that I had with the white pieces. But c4, the idea is to try to prevent him playing d5, and if bishop c6 then I can just push d5 myself. So perhaps instead of playing e5 I should just be waiting and castling, because also he doesn't have enough pieces yet on the e5 square to push e6 to e5. So probably a waiting move like castling or even h3 would have been okay there. So this is forcing. I mean, I expected bishop c6 sacrificing a knight, and then I have to decide if I'm going to take it, or if there's any other useful move that I can do, like bishop g5 or castles perhaps. Quite a slow game, only 6 moves played, and you can see we've almost spent a minute each. Clearcast was streaming this live, so if you have a chance to watch that, then he will probably notice more things than me being an observer to the games. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to calculate if that pawn is spiky on g4 when it drops after pawn takes f6, bishop takes f6. Not really a lot I can do to stop pawn at g4 coming, so perhaps what I should be doing here is to block out the bishop via knight at e4. Then if he chooses to put a pawn on d5, then I can trade for the bishop on f6 and then harass the queen, and then perhaps eventually save the bishop on c4, and then his bishop on c6 is blocked out. So I think knight at e4 would have been a good move here. d5, I mean, the same idea to block out the bishop, but it's a little bit risky because it's initiating a lot of trades, and if my queen ends up on d5, he can easily push it back via bishop at c6 after all the captures on d5. So yeah, expecting bishop takes c3 check, and then e takes d5. Trying to calculate if it's okay for my queen to return all the way to d1, or whether this just hands over too much initiative to my opponent. So yeah, I'm really not used to this, having to think so much after 8 or 9 moves. Yeah, I mean, what now? I'm committed to this bishop takes d5. He's going to throw in queen e7 check. I can't block this with the queen, so I'm going to have to drop the pawn somewhere. Normally I'd go pawn at e3, but I was a little concerned about knight at f4, that there may not be a good way to defend the pawn on g2. I don't really want to castle. I don't want to play rook g1 with the king on the open file. So decided to play pawn at e5. So at least then the queen is blocked out if d takes e5. And the idea is to gain a bit of time to hit the queen with knight at f5. But then if queen f6 after knight at f5, I don't have a second knight for h5, which would be really useful. So the knight's just hanging there on f5 after queen f6. That doesn't really work out either. So the other idea I had is to play bishop at g5 and then at least cut off the square f6. So probably I should just take the bishop and then come back to d1 with the queen. Perhaps even bishop at b5, take, bishop at c6, then queen e2 is a slight improvement to have the queen on the e-file. But yeah, running short of time, didn't really want to look too far ahead, so I decided to attack the queen via bishop at g5. So I let my time run way too low. My time management in the first game is really poor. It's actually 9 p.m. Sydney time this game was played. Mastertan is from Melbourne, so it's the same time zone. But yeah, I'm playing this first game like I've just woken up. I have actually been awake all day. But it's a really sloppy first game in terms of time management, and my play hasn't been so good either. So possibly a queen trade. But then I decided, the knight is really useless on e7, where his bishop is coming down already, taking on f3, possibly following up with queen at g2 or pawn at g2. So decided instead to make him think where to go with the king. Hopefully I can set up some bishop takes f6 with the pin, but I noticed he can go to d7. At least I can put the bishop on with check on g4 or h3. Yeah, I realized after the game it's probably better to play bishop at h3 check, surprisingly. But the reason is not so obvious at the moment. It's quite tricky the way mastertan did this. So he'll play queen at e4 check. This is the move I miss. It's a really good move, picking up the bishop. Not only this, leaves his queen hanging on e7, but is mainly threatening queen takes g2 in the end. Then all the pieces are hanging. And I don't have a knight for f6, so the knight is the piece I need. There's no way to defend everything. So I have to castle, get out of the way, but then because all my knights are hanging on g7 and f3, the second knight is really painful, and also he can take a rook anytime on h1. So the king is not even safe after castling. I have a check on b5 with the bishop in case he takes the knight, but or pawn at b2 was the other move there. And a desperate attempt to survive, but it's going to be too many pieces I'm facing, too many holes around the king. So the mistakes, it's already a lost position here. The mistakes came a long time ago. Yeah, and bishop at h3 was actually an improvement over bishop at g4, but quite hard to see the reason with low time. He already has a mate in 2 here with queen takes d1 check. He repeats the moves a couple of times, but it doesn't really make much of a difference because the knight is going to checkmate me anyway. If I drop it on f6 with check, he'll just sacrifice the queen. So yeah, this is over. Queen takes d1 check, he finds it, and that's game 1. So mastertan takes the first game with the black pieces. This is not a good sign for me. I have to pick up the level, play faster, play better. Game number 2, e4, e5. I'm expecting some sort of a, well, not exactly a random opening, but a sideline. You'd call the main line bishop c4 and, Italian game, or two knights defense, or with bishop e7 or d6 to be the main lines in Crazyhouse. Ray Lopez is already a sideline, so not many people play bishop b5. I saw after the game, Pawn in Training was saying a couple of the Russians, like Amadel, play this bishop b5, but I only get it once in every 500 games or so, once every 1,000 games maybe. So it reverts back to an Italian with the move a6 included, and I'm hoping that a6 moves will come in handy somehow. So if my bishop is attacked via knight a4 or c3 b4, bishop can come back to a7 to preserve itself, which could be useful. But if he doesn't attack the bishop on c5, it's possible that the a6 move won't play any bearing in the game whatsoever. In some cases it can be useful also if I want to cut off the square b5 for the bishop, if I want to hunt the bishop via knight a5. Doesn't always happen in these lines. So this is a very old line where you trade on f6 and go knight d5 with the move a6 included. I think bishop g4 makes sense to try and stop h3, because then I can sack the bishop for 2 pawns and really expose the king. And then all trades are good for black pretty much. So king h1. Right, so he still doesn't want to play h3, but it's up to me now to find a useful move. Thought about knight e7 or knight a5, but I didn't want to release control of e7. I don't want to play rook e8 because then f7 becomes slightly weak. So king h8 is pretty much always a good move in this sort of position. The other move I could have considered was bishop c to e6 and then trading for the knight on d5 that way. And I still have a useful bishop on g4. So if I had this position again, yeah, probably bishop c, e6. So knight at e3 I think is a very good move, because if I take, f takes helps to defend the knight on f3. Otherwise, I thought he wants to trade the bishop and then either play h3 or even bishop at f5, and then if I trade again, his pawn is just creeping closer to the king, and it might help him in the long term to attack via g6 and f7. So I really wasn't sure whether to let him take on g4. And still, again, it's hard to find a useful move for black. Could take on e3 and find something to do with the knight, perhaps knight at g5 or knight at h4, or bishop c e6 again. Yeah, I really don't like the move I played in the game, which you're about to find out in a second. Bishop g e6. This is really not a good move. Even bishop h5 was better, but this is really not a good move, because it seems like now I'm totally relying on getting a pawn for h3 with the bishops lined up on c8 and e6. So after king h1 is played, to make any progress I really need a pawn for h3, but it's just not coming. There's no way to take a pawn at the moment. f5 is too risky because it weakens g6 in case he gets a knight. So queen e2, just a waiting move, slightly improving the position. And again, I'd really like to play a move like knight a5. I just thought he might respond with a sudden strike with knight takes e5 and pawn at e7 coming. Thought it's too risky to release control over e7. Other moves I'm considering rook g8 just to solidify, rook e8 even to cover e7. There's not a lot going on in my mind at the moment. It's hard to find another plan. Knight e7 I don't like, but yeah, maybe I just should play the waiting move, bishop a7 even. So this is handing over the initiative because the queen is then hanging after knight at f5. He will take a bishop on e6 first to get rid of one of the defenders on f5, so that's a good move. I have to take with the bishop. And knight at f5 is coming. So where does the queen belong? Maybe he wants to sack on g7. He does have quite a few pieces in hand. So do I allow queen f6 bishop at e7 and give up the rook that way? And if the queen is on g6, I thought then knight 3 to h4, and wasn't quite sure whether the queen is safe on g5. Perhaps it was better than what I played. Well, a knight at f4 is not too bad. It's just a direct trade of the queens. He's responding instantly. Knight takes e7, knight takes e2. And I was half expecting bishop at g6. I was trying to calculate whether bishop at g8 is safe, with the idea of knight takes g8, f takes g6. Seems safe at first. Leave the knight there on g8. Bishop at f5 is another choice, and then I think I have to take bishop takes f5, and then one of the knights will take back. So then the target will be on g7. And I can defend with something like bishop at f6 or queen at g6 or queen at f6. But I actually missed a good move here, bishop at h3. So bishop at h after the trade on e3. He's going to take with the f pawn. There's no smother, maybe because the knight on f3 defends g1. But bishop at h3 would have been good here. He can't take that because the bishop at g2 check and the knight at f4 is very good for black. So I did not see that way in to his weakness on g2. So he's defending everything. Very good move, queen at f2. So I could possibly save the knight via queen at c2, bishop at d1, queen takes b2. Yeah, I didn't like the look of that. The other thing I could have done is knight at f4 and then taken back with the knight, just to keep some attack on g2. But I decided to go this way because there's some chance to play knight at g4, hit the queen, and then possibly follow up with pawn at e3 or pawn at g3, depending on what happens. I thought he might sack the queen and leave it there while knight takes f6. And then I really don't want to play g takes f6, take the knight, so just finding a way to defend. Bishop at d8. Noticing that he does not yet have a heavy piece for h7. Knight takes g7 is too slow. Knight takes h6 is too slow. So he's going to have to defend the knight or a counter-attack on my rook via knight at d7 or knight at h7. So take the knight. I'm happy if he takes the rook, but he goes knight takes f6. So then I just want to put the queen on for defense. Queen at g6. Threatening queen takes f6. He's going to defend. 1 second left. Pawn at g3. 0.1 seconds. If he takes the rook, rook takes bishop is okay at the moment. He would like a pawn for e7. I guess he's calculating if he can allow g takes. No, but yeah, that was a bad pre-move. Queen takes g3. I just made it myself. But there's nothing wrong with queen takes f6. I think white then would still have a lot of minor pieces, and for the queen, and he could. His king is actually quite safe with the rook on f2, knights on g3 and f3, defending the king, and he could keep dropping the minor pieces to hassle the queen. So I think white would still have the advantage, although it's far from being completely lost. I could have, of course, played on with queen takes f6 and get my king safe for a while longer. It would have been a mad time scramble. Anyway, so 2 games down in a best of 10. Not looking good at the moment. Game number 3. We have the same opening again. I put the bishop on c4, but this time bishop d3 seems slightly more solid. And I'm not going to rush into playing e4, e5. We'll just wait to see how he develops. So castle first this time. And now it's a race to get in e5. So black, I guess, is thinking about playing e6, e5 himself. And I wasn't sure whether to push d5 or take, maybe even put the pawn back on f5 to block out the bishop on d7. That's the safest way to play. So I'm getting in the move e5 first. This time there's no bishop c6 at the moment, so I guess Master 10 is thinking, well, it's not really enough to sacrifice a knight if I don't have any counterattack, although a move like castling, there's still a fair bit of work to do for me to crack open that kingside position when he has a pawn and he can either drop in defense on h6, g6 or even on g4, so no, castling I guess is okay. I probably should answer then with knight at h5 and then try and trade the bishop and put the bishop on and g5 and trap the queen. Other moves, knight g4 or knight h5, there's not really many alternatives. I think trading pawns is only going to favor white. So move number 7 again. He's having a long think. Knight h5. So I'm trying to find some way to move the knight from f3 with tempo. So I'd like to play the move knight g5, if that knight is well enough supported. So thinking about playing knight e4 and then one of the knights moving to g5, like knight f g5 uncovers the queen on d1. So the knight on h5 only seems to make sense if he can have another knight for f4. So I don't want to give up a knight too easily, because then he'll trade pawns and play pawn at h3, for example. So stick to the plan, play knight e4. Was possibly expecting a move like d takes e5, and then if d takes, pawn at g4. But I could also take back with the knight, and then again he's got to watch for queen takes h5. So interesting move, knight b4. And perhaps I should have just stuck to the plan and played knight fg5 and ignored the bishop on d3, because then c takes d3 is another way to try to block out this bishop c6 move. So my first thought is knight fg5 as indicated by the mouse, but somehow I changed my mind and moved the other knight. But I think my first instinct was much better, knight fg5. It already threatens bishop takes knight on h5. And everything is reasonably well protected. But this move, he could probably just castle here. So I'm not sure why he allowed knight takes f7. Because it's not so much of a real threat at the moment. But after his next move, d takes e5, because knight takes e5 is going to come with check, then the sacrifice is very powerful, knight takes f7. I thought about knight takes e5, then I realized just the direct sack is much better. So everything is going to hang in a second, the queen, the rook. Once I play knight takes e5, there's bishop takes h5 coming. I think white already has a decisive advantage. So I'm feeling pretty good about game number 3. And got to do better with the black pieces. So let's see if we play a similar Ra Lopez opening in game number 4. I'm already looking ahead to game number 4 because I think it's pretty much impossible to defend this position. So allowing the check, bishop takes h5 is coming. Ideas of playing knight at g6 check. Picking up the rook, and there's still f7, a huge weakness. So knight h4, attempt to defend g6 and possibly counterattack via g2. But there's no immediate danger, so I'm attacking first with pawn at h6. And yeah, I saw this coming with bishop takes e5. I certainly don't want to open up the d file when it's black's turn, because I have to watch out for knight at h3 check. And I can just drop the 2 pawns on h6 and g7. King e7, then there's still no threat. Even with a knight, he needs a heavy piece to make a threat. So I can just go ahead and take the rook, promote to a queen. And I could not see any immediate danger, so it takes black 2 tempi to create any sort of attack. Like bishop takes g2 and knight at h3 check. So I'm perfectly safe to play a non-checking move. And he's got nothing better than just queen takes h8. Then I can take the bishop on e5, open up the d file, threaten rook at f7 check, and also just simply pawn or bishop takes f6. So it should be over very soon. Blocking out the d file lets the king run, but here I'm just picking up lots of material. I could take the queen now, or just play a few more checks first. This allows me to play knight at e7, so picking up the bishop, that way there's one less piece pointing towards the white king side. So knight at e7 check, knight takes bishop, and then the intention is just to pick up the queen in the corner. So black has no heavy pieces, there's no possibility of a checkmate. Unexpected checkmate. Also, the bishop on h5 covers. Oh, the rook on f7 covers backwards. So it's just a matter of picking up some more material, and yeah, there's no counterattack possible. The bishop takes e2 at any time. I just wanted to play a few checks and make him waste his last remaining blocker. So yeah, the queen is safe on e4 for a check, so the queen is not on pre anymore, and then I can just pick up the pawn on e2. Maybe there's a forced mate with knight d6, but it really doesn't matter. I just want to make sure my king is safe. With the 2-second increment, there's no way that I can ever lose this game. Only if I lag and lose on time. So now when I sacrifice the queen on d5, yeah, so knight at a4 is the idea, and I want to push the king to a white square, or I can play pawn at b5 and pick up a knight with check and put it back on a5 or d6. So this wins the knight on a6, and you can see the rook on f7 defending backwards. I can even play king h1 next move if I wanted to. Perfectly safe, but yeah, why not take a knight and checkmate next move. Okay, so the score is now 1-2 in favor of mastertan. Alright, and I'm facing d4 this time, so we're going to get a completely new opening. We have a Trompovsky attack with bishop g5. So I have played knight e4 before. I think knight e4 is okay, but I decided to go to a somewhat familiar setup with h6 and g5. Couldn't decide. Well, actually, the time I'm spending the opening is mainly to set up via either d6 or d5, and I'm not sure which is best. I mean, d5, yes, it's principled, just to stop him playing e4, but I can play d6, and this helps to play against the dark squared bishop on g3. Just not entirely sure what I do with my bishop on c8. That's the main question. And possibly bishop g4. If f3, then tuck the bishop back via h5 and g6. So d6 is another way to go. You get a completely different structure. There's no knight e5 in that case, which is one of White's main plans. To just dump the knight in on e5 and leave it there, defended by the pawn and the bishop. And if Black plays knight c6, White then has to decide if and when to trade the knight. It does open the b file for rook b8, but it also weakens the c6 pawn in case of trading a knight at e5 again. And usually see queen e8 defending the pawn. Often it is good for Black to take if there is a follow-up, and it really depends on the exact move order and what the follow-up is. Like knight g4 hits the pawn on e5, knight e4. You have to calculate, is it safe to open the d file? Knight takes e4, d takes e4. Who does the queen trade favor? If the bishop is still on f1, then often it's good for Black to open up the d file and trade queens. So yeah, if knight at e5, thinking about just taking a bishop takes, there's a fair bit of space around the black king, which may seem weakening at first, but it does mean that even with a lot of trades of minor pieces, that it can be hard for White to set up any sort of checkmating pattern. So options here would include bishop h8, preserving the bishop, and then if I can pick up a bishop, like if I can play knight at b4 and pick up a bishop, then there's a threat to play bishop at g4 and fork the knight and the queen. So bishop at h8 is certainly an option. Other ideas, maybe just rook b8, target the pawn on b2. I didn't want to start doing mass trades. I don't like knight takes g3 because he hasn't castled yet, and that way h takes g3 becomes a possibility. What else? Knight at b4. Yeah, I'm not so convinced. It's okay to to try and target c2. Assuming he's going to go bishop takes e4. Then d takes e4, then at some stage there could be a piece landing on d3, or even knight takes c2 and then something landing on d3. Other idea with the pawn on e4, that it can be very useful if he decides to castle, because then a move like bishop at h3 becomes a serious danger. I think here I should have played f6 instead of king g7, king g8. So f6, because the bishop on f5 covers the square on e6, I think it was quite safe to play f6. Knight at h5, king h7. So I have good defense on f6. I have some coverage on the light squares. I could even follow up with the bishop at g6 or bishop at g4 if I wanted to. So here, this is a risky move to play bishop at g4. Perhaps bishop at g6 would have been a lot safer. Queen h5 on the last move for mastertan looked dangerous, but I guess he had to calculate if knight takes c2 was a worry, because I could even put the pawn back on g7 to defend. Otherwise it's very hard to defend g7. Oh, sorry, h6. Yeah, so pawn at g7 in that case. So here I'm expecting, and mastertan is calculating a queen sacrifice. Knight takes f5. And there are three options in that case. I could take the queen, allow knight takes h6, check, king h7. The safest move would be bishop takes f5. I probably should have done bishop takes f5, but the other surprising move here is knight takes c2, check, and then bishop takes f5 with the intention to drop something immediately on d3 afterwards. Okay, so he takes the bishop. Surprisingly, I thought he should have played bishop at f5 check, so I would like a pawn to block that check, but I didn't have a pawn last move, so the move order is important. He has enough bishops to checkmate me if I take his knight on h6, so I would have had to block with the knight on g6, and then knight takes f7 was quite powerful. So we're going to get a similar line with bishop at f5 check and knight takes f7, but he has a pawn instead of what could have been a knight when he takes f7, then trades the bishop on g6. So safety first, bishop takes e4, covers c2. I might as well just take the rook and hope there's some rook at d2 check, knight at c4 check. But even if the king is running away to f1, I didn't see a mate. So I was expecting knight takes f7, which did happen in the game. And I don't see that rook at d2 check is mating. So I have to defend, and really the best way to defend is just take all the pieces. So rook takes f7 I thought was pretty much forced. I didn't see another option. And just try and survive, expecting a bishop sack and bishop dropping somewhere like d3. I think I just have to drop the bishop back. Maybe king h6 and let him drop the bishop on g7 if the rook and the pawns were not enough to mate. It was probably okay to play king h6, although very difficult to see with only a few seconds left. So bishop at d3 was a decisive mistake. He could have just dropped all the pawn at h5 and so on. But this is the tricky move that he missed out. It's a deflection of the bishop. If he takes queen at c2 check, queen takes f2 check, and then the pawn and the bishop will mate on c2 and d2, with the knight very useful covering the pawn on c2 in the end. So in this case, it's just a mate into queen at d2 and queen takes b2. So really only one mistake from mastertan turned to be the fatal one, which was bishop at d3 in the end. Whereas he had 5 diagonal pieces, he certainly could have caused me a lot of worries if he just dropped them. Pawn at h5 check, pawn at g4 check, and so on. I was quite lucky to get away with that one. Game 4, this is 2 games all. We're going to a line which I've played against Bugzilla, another Aussie, still in the Crazyhouse World Championship. So a number of times he's caused me some problems defending with, I think it's bishop at e6, and then we get this really sharp line where he saves the pawn for d3, and then There's one line where I sack the queen early. A bit hard to describe right now, but very exciting games. This pawn at c4, I do believe it's a Finnish idea. Disrupting this little pawn chain here with d5 and e4. And then mastertan is in the tank, what to do to defend all the pawns. Probably what he did is the best option with d takes c4, but although white is quite comfortable after either capture, knight takes or queen takes e4. And then it's doubtful that the pawn on c4 is going to survive in the long term. So the idea of the opening is it's fairly safe for white. Often you can just pick up a pawn. If black defends the wrong way, then you can get some serious early pressure on h6 and g7 if the dark square bishop from f8 moves early. So the obvious threat is double checkmate, knight f6. So he's going to drop something on e6, I would assume. You can't play queen e7 because it just gets hit with knight at d5. So, do I pick up the pawn? Queen takes c4, calculating bishop at d5, queen e2. Seems okay. Knight c6 with the idea of knight d4. Probably just answer knight f3. Although black is a pawn down, he's getting some quick development, and perhaps there's something sharper I can do than queen takes c4. So I'm thinking of other options like attacking via pawn at h6 or knight at h5. So deciding on pawn at h6, I think mastertan made a mistake here and took the pawn where he should have perhaps just ignored it and defended the square f6. Seems to be his biggest weakness. Perhaps even a move like bishop at e7, defending everything, or rook g8. So knight at f6 check, the obvious move. That means no more castling for mastertan. His king is stuck on e7. I don't have to be in a hurry to do anything. So as long as I can quickly bring out the bishop on c1 by playing d4. I think this is a good move order, queen takes c4, because if pawn at d5, it looks like the obvious move, pawn at d5. Queen b4 check is okay to save the material. The other move which I was seriously considering is queen d4. So that way he can't take on e4 because of the queen trade and then replacing the queen checkmate. So queen d4 also eyeing off the rook in the corner via knight takes d5 check. The other move to consider is a rather shocking blow. Queen takes c7 followed by pawn at d6. I really wasn't sure whether I'm getting enough. After queen takes d6, knight takes, the king can take either knight, but then the other one will come back to e4. I wasn't sure whether that's enough. Possibly not, but he decided to play a more defensive move anyway, pawn at d6. So I feel free to just play d4 and open up the bishop on c1 and possibly pawn at g5 next. Well, pawn at e5 is also good. So d4 coming. It means there's no more queen d4 with the idea of hitting the rook on h8, but I think the merits far outweigh this, opening up the bishop on c1 and planning a pawn drop on e5 or g5. So I wasn't really sure what to expect. Maybe bishop at g7. The knight's having a real stranglehold on black's position, and he's got to do something to disrupt those knights on e4 and f6 because he can hardly move anything. And again, d5 can just be answered by queen b4 check. Queen takes c7 might even work. Actually, queen takes c7, no good. He could answer bishop at a5 check after I played d4. So, but queen b4 check was perfectly fine. So pawn at e5, knight c6, And I mean, I was thinking about some captures and trades, thinking about pulling the knight back from f6. But I thought, well, the simplest move is just develop the other knight on g1 and defend everything. And again, d5, there is queen c5 check, which he cannot allow because he has no blocker. Even if he did have a blocker, he still cannot allow it. So yeah, nothing wrong with just bring the knight to f3, and then he's only got 2 seconds, has to make a move. Trading is not good, but I really don't think there was anything else. Taking with the knight is best because then that gives me options to discover check after bishop at h4. And there are just too many threats here to cover everything. Knight takes h7 check, for example. So running out of time, but I think it's an overwhelming position for white. So Mugwort has taken the lead, 3-2 for the first time in the match. We'll see if I can go ahead. So Ra Lopez again. Expecting a different variation. Actually, we haven't had a real Ra Lopez like this because in game 2 it was more like an old line with the bishop coming back to c4. But this is very different with the bishop on a4 because at some moment he could take and then knight takes e5. So I guess it's now or never if he wants to do that. King h8 is a very useful move because the typical trap is if I played d6 and bishop g4 or h6, then he can take on c6, and then there's problems with knight at e7 check and picking up the pawn on c6. So it's a typical theme if the king is still on g8. But with the king on h8, it actually makes this queen sack line a lot better because then if bishop takes queen, you go knight f4, and then there's some serious counter-attacking chances. With the big weakness on e2 and also g2. There's like bishop h3 coming, or knight at e2 check, followed by bishop h3. So mastertan is playing a safer way and taking back e takes d5, knight e7. There was another choice to play pawn f6, and this is another advantage of playing king h8, that you can often play f7, f6, and there's no danger. The only real danger I have is if I allow him to pick up a pawn for h6. So the move knight takes e5 looks critical here. I really wasn't sure what's happening after knight takes e5. So d takes, pawn at f6. I guess I just have to take and put the pawn back on g7 and hope to defend. So if he sacks the bishop as well, it means he would have sacked 2 pieces, but only has 1 knight in hand. So possibly black is surviving, but it looks scary. Alright, so I think this trade is very good for black. Where he takes on e7 because now I can start building with knight at f4. I don't need to save the bishop via bishop a7. I mean f5 is kind of tempting, but again, no need to do this since he probably wants to get rid of the bishop anyway on c5. I just let him take it. And there's also no need even to play bishop at e2 because this allows the knight to come back to e4 and then he'll pick up 2 pieces for the queen. And the queen's not even causing any direct checkmating threats at the moment. I mean, bishop e2, probably still a good move because I would have bishop h3 at the end if I can pick up the queen. That's very dangerous. I thought just take back the knight and then I have extra attacking options with knight at e2 check and bishop h3. So what it means is that if he attacks the queen like this, I don't have to save the queen because tempo with attack is all important here. So I'm already threatening knight at e2 check, and that's about mate in 4. So he has to cover the square g2. The key square to cover here is g2, where the checkmate will happen. So knight at e3 is the best defense. And then I have to decide, well, do I save the queen via f6, which seems okay. But to attack, I really need to get rid of the knight on e3. So I'm thinking, what's the best way to do this without dropping all my pieces? So bishop at d4 is probably a bit too slow. What are the other choices? And noticing also that he can take back f takes e3, and then he has an extra square f2 for the king to run if necessary. I thought about even queen takes h4, sacrificing a queen, but then the knight on h4 also helps to cover the square g2, which is key. So I decide the best way to get rid of the knight on e3 is to go knight takes g2, surprisingly, and then knight takes e3. So my main threat here is to go knight takes e3, and that is definitely worth giving up the queen, because then g2 is too hard to cover. I'm also threatening to win a piece via knight takes h4. So very difficult decision. Mastertan gets rid of the knight on e2. I could go knight takes bishop, but I thought this is even better. Knight takes e3. So massive threat to play pawn at g2. I thought he had to do what he did, which is f takes e3. Pawn at g2, and I was expecting king g1, in which case, yeah, I can pick up the rook, but then there's no immediate follow-up. I wasn't sure whether to give it back with rook at g2, win the queen, queen takes, bishop takes, king takes, and then have to find a mate. Whereas what Mastertan did, queen takes g2, I think it makes this a lot easier for me, because then the queen at e2 check seems really strong. So if rook f2, I was probably just going to sack the queen for two pieces via queen takes f3 and then queen takes h4. So that way the black king is very safe, and there's still holes everywhere around the white king. But with anything else dropping on f2, bishop h3 was always going to be my response, because then I'm setting up a mating net via queen takes f3 check. And if the king moves up to g3, just knight at f5 is enough to finish the game very quickly. So it's mate in 3. That was the first check I saw, knight at h5 where the mouse is, but no, this is much better, because after queen takes h4 is mate in 1, whether he blocks with the bishop or anything else. So that's a safe pre-move. Okay, 4 games to 2 with the white pieces again. We'll see if we have the same opening or something different. Or going back to games 1 and 3. Which were not that comfortable for me, I have to admit. So slightly different move order, but yeah, similar position. It's hard to imagine Mastertan not playing the move knight f6 in this. Yeah, so same opening again. Bishop d3 seemed to work out better than bishop c4. So I'm going to stick to this. So it was knight c6 castles, bishop e7 in game 3. We'll see if Mastertan varies the move order. Bishop e7, so leaving the c6 square vacant in case I want to push e5. Wasn't sure whether he was aiming to play bishop c6 immediately, but castles first. So e5 is the obvious move, but I'm looking for alternatives. I mean, how else to improve the position? If d5, he can push e5 and open up the bishop to hit h3. That's not so good. I mean, it's not so bad, but it's nothing special. And the other move is bishop g5. So it looks a little strange because it doesn't create a threat. But one idea is even to trade on f6, then push e5, because it comes with tempo. And that helps open up the bishop on d3. I mean, I want to push e5 to stop him playing e5, so I think it is necessary. And we notice again that there's no bishop c6 in response. So it's a different position here because there's no immediate way to play knight e4 and knight g5 like I did in the previous game, in a similar position, game number 3. So knight h4, knight h5 again. I guess he's worried a similar thing is going to happen with the knight just hanging out there. So knight g4 again. It looks like it's dangling in mid-air, this knight on g4, because I want to set up some bishop takes h7, knight g5. So bishop at h4, you notice leaving that square g5 vacant. And I think he has to play f6. It's necessary for black to play f6, because you can see what will happen in the game after queen e8. There's an immediate tactic with bishop takes h7 check and knight g5. So not only wins a pawn, but yeah, there are some serious weaknesses on f6, g7 and h7. He's hoping, I guess, to wait for queen h5, then he can meet this with bishop at g6 defending. And even a queen sack, queen takes g6 is very tempting after that. Other defensive ideas for black? I guess he could put a bishop on g6 now, but then I'd probably attack via the dark squares, pawn at f6. Pawn at h6 also possible. But yeah, my mouse is hovering over the square f6 because that's the key square here. So I already saw this coming with the threat of knight at f6 check. The main idea is g takes f6 and knight g e4 check. Knight takes f6 check is unstoppable. So I was just calculating here to see if pawn at h7 led to a forced mate, because if I could somehow move the knight and bring the bishop quickly to f6, this would be checkmate, but I didn't see a way to do that that's completely forcing. I'm sure it's still good anyway, but yeah, knight g e4 is a forced mate. It's something like mate in 7. So something drops on g7, knight takes king h8. And I just have to make sure the queen sack works and there's no escape with the king running back to f8. But because he has to take back the knight on e8 with a piece, there will be something. So there'll be some black piece landing on e8. And that way there's no escape for the king. So yeah, queen takes g7 is the move. I'm just absolutely making sure that it works. Obviously nothing wrong with knight takes queen, but queen takes g7 is much more forcing. And there'll be a pawn at f6 and a mate to follow. Yeah, so resigns. The scoreline is now 5-2. One more game will seal the match. We'll see if we have another Rilo pairs and if mastertan can make any improvements. So bishop b5, I mean a6 is not necessary. There are other moves like knight f6, bishop e7, d6 even. But yeah, I'm doing this intentionally because the bishop on c5 is the most active square, and it seems like with mastertan playing moves like king h1 and knight at e3, he's just a little bit worried about that bishop on c5. So I'll go back to a similar line where I'm going to play king h8 and let him decide if he wants to play bishop g5. Perhaps h6 is another try here. I'm not sure. I've never played this h6 before. We're noticing that the bishop is not on b3 yet, so perhaps h6 is another line, which is not too bad. d6 will just transpose bishop g5, and then I think it's very important to play king h8 in that position. Yeah, I think what I was talking about before was that if you don't play king h8 and play h6, then bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, knight d5, queen d8. And that's when bishop takes c6 and knight at e7 check is very good for white, picking up the pawn on c6. So that we get a new move here, knight at a5. And it's a little unclear If and how to defend the pawn on c6. Do I have to defend it? I'd rather counterattack somehow. Bishop. Bishop where? Bishop at b6, possibly. Queen e8 I was almost tempted to play, but then bishop takes knight, g takes. We were talking about this after the game. And knight at h5. And then how to defend the pawn on f6. Can play rook g8 and sacrifice a lot of material, but is it worth it? Bishop h3 perhaps to follow. It's unclear. Mastertan favours the bishops for black in that case, where I thought because of the weakness on f6, and that also means there are lots of other squares that are weak, like h6 and g7 and f5. Yeah, it remains to be seen whether bishop takes f6 is any good. This is certainly the safest move, bishop at d7. Maybe not the best move, though, because it leaves black a little stuck for a plan, like what to do to improve the position. Rook b8, rook b1, bishop b4, knight c3, knight c4. The knight's coming back via e3 and f5 perhaps at some stage. So queen d2 is a very good move because now there's no h6. It's too dangerous to allow the sack, and then queen takes h6 check. So the eternal question, how to improve black's position? Do I bother playing rook g8? I mean, if I allow pawn at h6, is it too dangerous? It's a prophylactic move against a future pawn at h6. I'm not sure it really helps that much. Rook g8. Always got to watch out for a smothered mate on f7, of course. Yeah, I wasn't sure what to expect. Knight h4, it's a good move. Knight wasn't doing much on f3. So here it's defending against one of my main targets, which is on g2. And again, I really need to trade a pawn. A pawn is a piece I want for h3, but it's not coming. If I play d5, it picks up a pawn, but then it also allows pawn at b7 in response. So rook b8 is a measure to defend against this. And also the pin from the bishop on g5 is very annoying to get out of. And playing d5 is generally the thing I want to do. It's just doesn't quite work at the moment. So rook b8 first. Yeah, d5 and possibly even bishop back to e7 is a way to defend some of the dark squares. But now the e5 pawn is hanging after d5. I decided to do a few trades. I thought trades were not too bad for black. And I had some ideas what to do with the rook. Either rook at h5 or rook at g4. I'm expecting rook at g3 in response, but the move I missed here was rook takes g5. So it would have been good to throw in rook takes g5 with the idea of rook takes and then bishop at f4. That would have been really good. Really good for black. And knight at f4 is also not too bad. So the aim is to separate the defense. My main problem here is the time. My position is okay. I'm not down any material. I've got a lot of defenders around the king at the moment. Knight takes e4 is interesting. I can't explain this move except that it just creates total madness and chaos on the board, which is what I want. Hard to know whether it's good or bad objectively. But I think after the trades, because I have two bishops defending the rook on g4, what's important is that I don't lose too much material because there's no direct attack. So I should go rook takes d8. The move is rook takes d8. And then I'm threatening rook takes h4. But somehow, I mean, I saw bishop takes h4. I just thought I had something with knight at e2 check or pawn at g4 or pawn at h3. It's just nothing seems to work. I'm giving up too much material. Yeah, the knight sack is really not worth it. And I was intending knight takes h3, but actually he can just respond with rook takes h3. So mastertan missed this, and the pre-move would have lost instantly via knight at g6 check and rook at h7. And that's why I cancelled the pre-move. I saw this, and then I realized, oh no, I'm just lost if I have to throw in queen at g6 check, because then rook g3, and then I don't even get to take the rook at all. But I missed a good move in pawn at g4, I think it was there, and then it's kind of taking advantage of the king on g2. Idea to take the bishop on f3 with check. But yeah, now I have to defend, and then yeah, bishop at d5, pawn at e4 is a good response. But he's just going to keep putting knights on, threatening the smothered mate on f7. I have to keep defending. Queen at h5, slight improvement, and pawn at h3. Here I don't have to take the knight back immediately. Probably doesn't make too much difference, because he's going to answer bishop at f3, defending everything. And the counter-attack is way too slow. So he can take his time here, build up an attack via pawn at e7, rook at f8. Bishop at f3 saves a lot of tempi for him, because it's just too hard to generate any sort of attack. I'm just desperate here. But he has everything under control. So I need to defend with a move like rook at e8, but no, even that it doesn't work. So it's the last trap, playing knight at f6, because if he takes with the bishop on h4, they still have a smother mate, rook at g1, but no, and he's not going to fall for that. So I move like, yeah, bishop takes h3, there's no more attack. Running out of time, and now bishop takes f6 is winning. So very good game from mastertan. That was a pretty high quality game from his point of view. Yeah, missed a good move there with rook takes g5 and bishop at f4 at some key moment. But he seems to play very well in positions where there aren't too many trades, and he's finding slight ways to improve his position and leaving me struggling with the plan, how to develop the pieces. So yeah, very interesting move, this knight at a5. Alright, game number 9. The scoreline is 5-3. And this time we have a different move order with bishop c6. So my immediate instinct says push d5, sacrifice a pawn, because something is going to happen if he takes 3 times, and then might be some bishop b5 check, or bishop takes h7, something outrageous like this. Yeah, I rushed into this queen e2 move. It wasn't necessary. I could have just simply played bishop e2, and that defends the pawn on d5. That would have been a lot better. Just play bishop e2. Yeah, I don't know why I rushed this queen e2, because now it's not so clear that I have anything in return for the pawn. I mean, I'm the one that has to prove it. I've given up a pawn. Possibly knight takes d5, queen takes e7, or queen takes first, knight takes d5, and then queen at c8, with the idea that something's going to be weakened, like b7 if he drops the queen. If he drops a knight on d8, I'm still looking for an idea, which is not immediately obvious. Perhaps chasing the knight away from d5, and then c7 is hanging. But yeah, another move is to go pawn at g5, and then we get mass trades on f3 and e2. So I think he has to take on f3, which is good for black, it seems. And then g takes. So the key moment in the game is coming up now. Queen takes e2 is a very good move. I should go bishop takes, otherwise bishop takes g2 is even stronger, with knight at f3 being check. This could be important in some lines. So bishop takes e2, bishop takes g2 anticipated. So notice the bishop on g2 is still covering b7, and that's in case of queen at c8 check. But what would have been good is to play queen at c8 check, queen at d8, initiate the queen trade, so his king is on d8. And then I have some extra options, like either bishop g5 or queen at g5. even taking on G7 first, and then queen at G5 check would have picked up the bishop on G2. So I think here queen at C8 check is the move. I'm just desperately looking for some way to prove that I'm not 2 pawns down for nothing. But yeah, queen at C8 was the move. I did not do it. What did I do? Some rubbish like knight at F5. Yeah, I was just about to play queen at C8 now, but then I changed my mind. Knight at F5. So I just noticed a cheap trap that he can't take on H1 due to knight takes G7 check, deflecting the bishop. But somehow I didn't even see that he could take the pawn on F6, and then I have nothing in response. So I need a pawn for G7, I need a knight, I need something, but I have no pieces except for a queen, which is not enough to do anything. So the only thing left is to save the rook now, rook G1. And now it looks like I'm just 3 pawns down for nothing. I mean, maybe it's not really for nothing, but I'm hoping to stick something on G7 eventually, or have time to play bishop H6. Take the bishop, make some threats. It's all a bit slow though. Even if bishop H6, he could perhaps play pawn at D2 check. Bring the bishop back and then do something. So rook G8 covering any possible threats on G7. Yeah, I almost thought about rook takes G2 check, queen and E4 check I think would have been the best. So, and then he could possibly end up with triple pawns with pawn E6, pawn takes F5. Yeah, it's probably the way to go though. Rook takes G2 and queen at E4 check. This move again is a bit desperate because I know that I have to attack. 3 pawns down for nothing otherwise. At least there's no checks winning a piece. I have the knight on B5 protected. Target is too obvious though on C7. You can just defend via knight A6. And I had this crazy plan. Again, rook takes G2 is probably the move. But I had this crazy plan to play queen at A4. And then not only threatening a double check, but also with ideas to sack the queen on A6 and then knight takes C7 check, knight takes rook. And then I'm just hoping that something will happen. But what I didn't see was that after all this, he has a queen at A5 check, and then the knight is loose on F5. And this is the big downfall of this plan. Didn't have time to think of a new plan, so let's just stick to it and hope for the best. So king D7, knight takes rook, queen A5 check, and queen takes F5. And because I have to block the check, I really would like to play bishop D2 in response. But then that allows queen takes D2, knight E4 check, and then he should mate on the back row with all the pawns. So that means I have to block with a pawn or the knight. Decide to keep the pawn because I thought the knight check was more scary for him to calculate. But 35 seconds should be enough to realize that queen takes F5 is safe, and rook at C7 check. Probably just king E8. Rook C8 is covered by the queen, and I have no more checks. Running out of ideas. And he's threatening stuff like queen takes F2 check as well that I have to defend. And defending is not what I want. I mean, maybe he's worried about rook takes G2 picking up an extra bishop in this line. And maybe that's why he thought he couldn't move the king backwards after queen takes F5. But this gives me an extra piece, and amazingly knight at B6 check was the move to block out the queen, and then rook somewhere, like rook C7. Apparently there's a mate in 7 with knight at B6. Obviously I did not see this during the game. And knight B8 should have just been answered by king C8, which renders the knights on B8 and A8 completely useless. And I have not enough pieces. He was right about knight takes D6 check, but there was a defense, which is too hard to explain in the video, but it's just a mad time scramble now. There's always going to be a mate with the king going forward, so he really should have gone backwards, and even if he thought it was dangerous, because there's no way the king is surviving here. I can just pick up the rook if there's no mate. I think I missed a mate before, but it doesn't matter anyway. It's because any trades must be good for white. I have a queen in hand, threatening queen at C4, queen at E4. Yeah, So unlucky for Mastertan because he was certainly winning if the king went back to c8. Yeah, and the pawn for c4 and the queen at c4. Yeah, just too much. And the queen on f5 to finish. So very lucky to win this game number 9, but it does seal the match 6-3. So that is officially the end of the match. It means that Mugwort reaches the candidate stage. The next match will be against King Switcher. So it's not for anything except for a bonus $25 to see who gets through the winner's bracket undefeated. And there will be 4 of us eventually undefeated in the winner's bracket. So yeah, just having another look at queen takes f5, and then it looks like black is completely safe. We're just having some chat after the games. So yeah, Mastertan said that he'd enjoyed this 10-game match, or 9-game match, a lot more than the others, because I guess we had some completely unique positions, especially Mastertan playing a variant of the Wolf opening with e6, d6, bishop d7, which I've never seen before. And also, I've hardly seen these Ra Lopez openings before. Yeah, and with this early king h8 to avoid the traps. And that's about as much as I knew to play king h8, and then we're both on our own. So it means that there will be 4 winners undefeated in the winners bracket, which include Jisugi and GSVC, myself and King Switcher, Chicken Crossroad and the Finisher, and also Variants Only and Schwanet. And there will be 4 pairings to be played sometime in the next couple of weeks. But Mastertan is not out of it. Mastertan still has a match to follow, and he has to win 2 matches in a row to make the candidates. So if you go into the elimination bracket, you have to win 2 games at this stage, 2 matches, and there will be 4 to qualify from the elimination bracket. So Mastertan has to play Shabrat, who had some good upset victories in the last couple of matches. And if he gets through there, he'll have to play the winner of Anjur Nakamura and Jeremy Durham. So that will be the final match to qualify. So these matches have been getting more and more tense, more and more close, and tightly contested in the candidate stage. And looking forward to streaming some matches. It's been a while, but I hope to get back to it as we get into crunch time with the qualification stage, and there'll be some fun matches for $25 to follow. So thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this match, and we'll see you soon when there are more Crazyhouse World Championship matches to follow.